Hey everyone, and welcome to this webinar by VOQUZ Labs. My name is Rogan Morrison, and I'm really excited to be able to help you in your quest to reduce costs. Doesn't matter where you are in your SAP license journey, in the switch to S/4HANA or just standard on ECC. And with me today, it will be my pleasure to introduce you to Ioana Miku, who is our technical specialist on our SAMQ solution. Welcome, Ioana.
Hi, Rogan. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me join this
Hey.
webinar. And also, thank you for the introduction. And as you said, I'm responsible at VOQUZ for the delivery of our tool, SAMQ, but more on that later in the webinar.
Excellent. Thanks, Ioana. We'll be catching up with you just a little bit later. And as we said, what we really want to focus on in today's webinar is about SAMQ and our advisory queue solution and the combination of these two tool sets that really help you to reduce your costs. So let's jump into the webinar and get this going here. So first of all, why do we specifically look at this topic? So you'll see that on the left-hand side, we've got some specific key elements that we look at and that customers are really looking at in terms of their SAP engagement and the way in which they're managing this SAP landscape that they're busy on. So digital transformation and the challenges that they face regarding this are key on many CIOs' agenda. This comes down to looking at the infrastructure layer. So are they on a HANA database? Are they going to transfer off existing databases onto HANA? How are they going to make that change and all the relevant elements that come around with the different changes in infrastructure and platform? What about 2027? So most customers who are on enterprise pack higher than 5 have got until 2027. If you are not on enterprise pack 5 and above, you actually have a challenge in that your maintenance will actually change from 2025. So you need to be aware of the constraint that you have on your maintenance agreement with SAP, and there are deadlines that SAP have put forward, and how do you manage around those deadlines? And then, of course, cloud technology is increasingly popular. Why? Because there's levels of cost savings, there's levels of automation, there's an enormous amount of development made by the hyperscalers to improve elements in the cloud infrastructure layer. And the cloud infrastructure layer, if you talk about and know about it, is really that layer that is enabling your application layer, which then empowers your business layer and your business people to actually do the things that they're supposed to do in the business processes. So this is really important element around understanding the cloud technology and how that impacts your organization. And then do we go for cloud or partial cloud? Where do we stand? So many organizations ask us the question, what's the best option? And how do we get the best out of our infrastructure layer in order to, as I said, empower the application layer and enable the application layer? And then importantly, what we spoke about and what we've really mentioned across this webinar is around the cost savings. So what are the levers that enable us as an organization to make cost savings a reality in today's circumstances? And that's really what we're going to be looking at. So how does one save costs in our license space? So let's have a look at how do we get that. So this is the topics we're going to cover. I think what's important to understand around this in the licensing context is that most organizations need to understand that there's a 3x3 strategic matrix that they need to determine. First of all, on the left-hand side, you have the principles of the license construct and the way in which it can be adjusted. So you'll see that you can either have a contract conversion, you could have a product conversion, or you could just wait until 2027 happens, or wait until 2025, which is only 2 years away. And then you have to combine that with the infrastructure platform layer upon which your application sits. So do you decide to stay on on-premise or on-premise and cloud, have a hybrid scenario? What happens to your databases in that context? Are you going to be multiplying the cost by 2 in terms of the databases? What happens if you just stay on cloud or you move to cloud in totality and you move totally off-premise? How will you manage the application management support? Are you going to have a total SaaS contract negotiation to go into where you have software as a service and you have your platform as a service or your infrastructure as a service, PaaS and IaaS, etc.? and or you're just going to stay and remain totally on a premise basis. And that on-premise basis may also be in a cloud infrastructure, not be on RISE, for example, where it's managed by a hyperscaler or it's managed by SAP directly. So the combination of the contract conversions, the product conversions, and the licensing transformation needs to be considered against the infrastructure, and that's important to note. So quite a lot of complexity is added to the cost layer in that context. And when we look at the cost layer, you can see that there are actually a significant number of layers. It's not just one layer that you need to understand. It's actually multiple layers. And you need to be able to delve into each of these layers. That's what we're going to take you through. So what is comprised of each of these layers in order to decompose them or break them down into smaller pieces in order to understand the principles under each of these in order to determine how to determine the cost savings benefits. So if we look at across this, we've got all the way from the top user licenses, and I'm not going to go through every single one, but all the way down to return on investment through IS funding, migration costs, application management, infrastructure, etc. So you have to break down each of these elements from a cost pool perspective in order to determine what is the optimum use of my application, again, on the infrastructure that I've actually determined, in order to determine how much cost savings potential I will actually achieve. That's really the principle of what we're trying to get to for most organizations. So the value of the cost savings, what is that to them? And how do we determine the return on investment over the changes that they're going to be making? So let's jump into each one specifically and have a look at some of these key elements. So first of all, user licenses. Most organizations maybe don't focus enough on the user licenses. And why do I say this? Because in the past, most organizations have just been using the allocation principle. So allocate a license to an individual, an end user, that would enable them to perform the relevant execution of business processes that they need to do on a day-to-day basis. And this is where we significantly differ from a USMM measurement in the context of what we do in the VOQUZ way. And really that is to actually not provide just an allocation, but rather to look in more detail specifically at the usage that takes place based on transactional execution of transaction codes by specific end users in order to determine which is the best license type from an end user perspective to be on. Okay, and once you've done that, you then need to build in the change which is going to take place, which means you're going to move from an ECC license now to an S4HANA license. And if you decide to go the RISE, you need to then build in the FUE, the full use equivalent counts. So this is important to understand. So what do we see from an optimization potential? It's quite easily laid out there. On the current ECC inventory, we see that there is a significant optimization potential all the way of 35%. If you're currently sitting on ECC, it's a great way to say start your cost savings initiative. And if you go to an S4HANA side, you can see that grows automatically up to about a 57% increase in terms of what you can do from a cost savings perspective. If we take that further now and we go and look at the specific engines, okay, here on engines it's different to user licenses because you're not looking at the usage of individuals, you're looking at the usage of a specific engine based on certain metrics that have been predefined. And it's very important to understand the metrics and the usage of the engine, and that is determined by various different factors. So when you do a contract conversion or a product conversion in the context, you need to understand which engines are actually going to be taken across and if there's a significant amount of shelfware. If you can determine that, then you can immediately identify what value of cost savings potential is available to you as your organization. And this is where we help organizations to look at the metrics, to look at the items and things like that. So important to note this and to see how do we actually make sure that we get the right cost elements out from an engine perspective. And here you can see below the relevant information related to the cost savings potentials for engines. Okay, new products on S4HANA. So when switching to S4HANA, there are certain products that are no longer offered. So it's very important to understand what those products are and also to determine whether there are new types of metrics or whether the products that are being replaced are more expensive and if they need to be identified or not. So you can see that in the bottom little graphic over here, you can see that new products actually can increase the cost spend that you may have in moving to S4HANA quite significantly on both sides of the graphic here. And that's important to note so that you get the right cost elements out. Okay, and here's an example of what we have found from a financial risk evaluation that we do related to our VOQUZ approach. And you can see that on the left-hand side here, we have the total cost, the RISE FUEs, the Cloud Platform Enterprise Agreement, CPEA, your preferred success model at 20% and disaster recovery. In terms of the initial proposal that SAP provided, you can see the total looking at about $1 million. And if you look at once we've optimized this and we've actually done a detailed demand assessment, determining exactly what you need and how you need to pull these applications into your product stack and into your application layer, then you can see the significant savings that we've actually been able to raise. And these occur not only just in the total, but across the user counts, the CPEA, the preferred success, and the disaster recovery. Now, if you are a customer looking at this and you say a cost savings of just under 50%, that is a significant amount. And this is what we offer from a VOQUZ Labs perspective. So really important that you get the right value for bang for your buck. Okay. Again, unallocated cost allocations of S4HANA. I think it's important to understand the variations here in terms of the cost conversion perspective from an optimization perspective. You can see that on the left-hand side here, you will actually get a 10% higher new cost is required to convert from an ECC contract to an S4HANA contract. And here you can see the differentiator between users and engines on the left-hand side and how that grows. So in the new S4HANA model, you have significant more S4HANA users and a smaller proportion of engines. So there's an increased cost on your user base, and you need to be aware of that when you look at the conversion into an S4HANA new contract perspective from a licensing optimization perspective. Okay, as we said here, why is it therefore so important to get the users right? If you're increasing the cost of and the value of users in the S4HANA space as compared to engines, it makes the viability of doing an optimization potential even that more important. And as we showed earlier, you can see that the cost potential of 35% in terms of cost potential savings is really where the value sits in the user's perspective. So please, that's most important to have a look at. Get the most out of your user licenses and make sure that you've optimized them before you move to your S4HANA. Okay, so you can see that represented in this slide here in terms of effective available budget. And you can see that in many cases here, the engine additional costs, and we've just spoken about users. Now we look at engines, we can increase that significantly as well. So if you take out the shelfware, you can use that available budget to extend and improve additional products that you may want to have after optimization and increase that quite significantly. Right, what I'd like to do is hand over to Joanna in this case to take us through the technical processes that we do in order to run our SAMQ tool. And I'd like to hand over to you, Joanna.
Thank you, Rogan. So also, thanks for the introduction, but part of the reason why we're going to start with this introduction about our technical process is also for you to understand the context of the following slides, where we're going to show some examples of optimizations done for in ECC landscapes, then simulations for S4 licenses, and of course, RISE as well. So a bit of context here of about my role and how we conduct our projects and processes. Basically, the tool that I'm responsible for delivering is called SAMQ. So it's a license optimizers for SAP. we generally have a kickoff with the customer where, of course, we discuss the plan, the timeline of the project, the steps, and so on, and the customer receives the installation bundle. Now, the tool is an SAP add-on, so it's installed via transports. The installation process and the setup, as well as the customizing, is rather quick. So we guide the customer throughout the installation. As I said, transports, relatively quick, and authorizations, roles that would need to be delivered. Then what we do is plan remote sessions with the customers to get the tool configured in a way that's able to produce valuable reports for the analysis and possible contract conversions. So remote sessions with the customers, relatively quick, in my opinion, is the installation and the configuration. So we would start with the data collection. So for the tool to be able to produce the reports that we need or want to have a look at, we collect data on users' master data. So their validity information, their first name, last name, current license type, and last logon. As well as the user's actual transaction history. So we collect the logs on their activity transactions only, so that the tool's optimization process can actually recommend or optimize, identify an optimal license for the users based on their actual usage. And we start, of course, with the customizing of the tool after, which means when the first stage is data collection and default configuration for the tool, we'll then continue with customizing the tool for each customer in particular. Depending on each customer's contract, of course, there might be differences, restrictions, various special clauses in the contract, or different kinds of definition for the license types that customers have, or special types of licenses they might have. And in the end, we would produce reports, including simulations of license types, alternative license types, either for contract conversions or in the ECC landscape, for example, project users or logistics users. All of these steps we would do in partnership with our advisory colleagues. Of course, there needs to be a communication between the people configuring the tool, our colleagues from advisory who have meetings with the customer, who go through the customer's contracts and so on, and of course with you guys, the customers, as well, because everything needs to be configured with the customer in mind and the specific landscape in mind and the contracts in mind. And yes, the last stage in our setup is usually what we call the write back, or the enablement of automatic license updates, which means at that point we'll allow the tool to automatically assign the licenses in the target systems based on what it has earlier identified is optimal, and it can then be set up to run by itself.
Excellent, Gianna. And just tell me, I mean, we don't have to install this tool in every system, do we? We only install it once, is that right?
That's a very good question, and that is correct. So our tool is an add-on for one central system in a customer's landscape, which means we have a transport that would need to be delivered and installed in one system. Generally, it's the solution manager. And for all other systems, we generally just deliver roles, which are also based on standard authorization objects, which means no transports are needed, just authorizations, RFC connections to collect the data. That's why the setup and installation, setup, configuration, and customizing can be very quick.
Excellent. I think that's really what customers want, to make sure that they have a very quick installation and exit process. Great. Thank you for sharing that with us. Carry on. Great to hear from you in terms of how this works.
Also, thank you for the clarifying question. I think that's a very good question to point out for everybody listening. Right, so the next slide is showing as an example of a project, an existing BOM. I'll explain a little bit the tables so that you get an idea. The column on the left indicates the SAP standard ID for the license, but the most important part, of course, is the description. So you have a list of the licenses that we either identified with the tool as being active and used in the landscape of the customer, or the ones that we wanted to configure. Then next column, the inventory, is reflecting the customer's actual inventory, what licenses the customer has available for their users, what's available in their contract per category. And then I think the most important columns are measured in SAP and optimized. So measured in SAP would indicate the license is configured in the target system. As I mentioned earlier, the tool is reading, collecting the data from the target systems, and what it reads amongst others is of course also the assigned license. So we are able to reflect what licenses SAP or USMM would be able to pick up to compare them with the licenses that we optimize or the tool identifies as optimal for the users, which would be, of course, in the column called optimized. Now, I know it's highlighted, one line is highlighted, so we'll speak about that in more detail, but I just wanted to mention you see there are 392 users in the first line there that has no description. It's not a mistake. It just indicates that those users, 392 users, do not have a license type in the target system, which usually means that USMM will read those users as professionals. So what is also generally important in a measurement is that you do prepare for the measurement and make sure that all users have a license type assigned, so that it's your choice what license type they have and not the USMM's choice of assigning a professional license. Now, the row highlighted, referring to the professional licenses, the inventory is 1,520, you see that, and measured in SAP, the customer has configured 1,120, not counting also the 392, which might be considered professionals if a measurement would run now. But you also see the column optimized. So the tool actually recommends 867 users in that category, a lot less than what has been configured in the system. And how the tool identifies that, or the basis for the optimization, is the user's activity. So the tool does collect the transaction history for the users. And based on that, the tool has a specific system in place or a logic behind it that links a license type to a type of transaction, be it either if the transaction is creating, changing, displaying data, or depending on the transaction's application component. So if it's a financial transaction, logistics transactions, the tool would handle the activity differently and link it to a license type differently. Of course, it can also be configured, customized to handle in a different way. But roughly put, this is how the tool is optimizing the licenses. And as you see there in the category of professional, reducing the count of professional in such a way can lead to quite significant cost saving potential. In the table underneath, you see the costs. So we have the price per unit in euros listed there. So professional license here is listed with 3,200 euros. And you see from the total of, sorry, zooming in, 3.5 million costs for the professionals currently configured in the system compared to 2.7 what the optimized output would be from the tool. Now, the prices are list prices, so there would be discounts, but I think you get a very good idea of what such an optimization would mean in a landscape and reducing the licensing costs.
Fantastic, Joanna. And I want to ask a question there. So, what happens when you have really different types of licenses, so ISH licenses and customers that have unique licenses? How does the tool handle such things?
Okay, thank you for asking that.
Mm.
Also, a very good question. So, this example that you saw earlier is, we chose it to highlight the most often, most frequent licenses we come across. So we have the professional limit, the professional employee and ESS, but what we do very often is, of course, configure other kinds of license types or simulate license types. For example, logistics worker, shop floor user, retail user. We can do that. The tool has built-in templates, and of course, our knowledge comes in there as well when we configure it to make sure it actually fits every customer's landscape and user's activity, so that there are not any differences between the industries. But generally speaking, we do have a lot of flexibility with the tool. The tool's customizing to configure, set up, and adjust any sorts of license types. So as long as we have a definition for a license type or we have a rule set, we are able to configure Industry-specific licenses, like you mentioned, the healthcare licenses, we are able to configure any sort of custom licenses, like there might be call center licenses or ISU licenses, any sort of specific license types we can customize and configure. Yeah, so
And
it's
this,
a part of, sorry, the part of the customizing of the tool where we're actually in partnership with our advisory colleagues and the customers are making sure that the tool's configuration matches the contract and the customer's particularity, the landscape's specific restrictions or users' activity.
absolutely. And I think that's really what differentiates VOQUZ Labs is that you don't just have a tool system running on its own where you need to figure it out. You actually have advisors looking into the contract details, determining what is the exact license definitions. And some of those can be really complicated. And therefore, we actually help and ensure that the license definition types that are actually written into the tooling match the contract in order to make sure that the usage is as accurate as possible. And I think that's really a big difference when customers come to us and ask for advice because we can able to do that. And when we talk about S4HANA, I mean, we've got a slide there as well, and maybe you want to talk us through the S4HANA approach because customers are now stuck in the position of wanting to understand how do they move their ECC user licenses, and I spoke about the cost related to it, but to S4HANA, we can simulate that, of course, can't we?
Yes, that's true. So, and you are right. Very often we do have customers that are interested in at least understanding what their S4HANA licenses would look like or how many they would need based on the current setup. So, as you know, there's with ECC licenses, there's quite a high number of licenses out of which customers maybe could not always choose out of, but there's a large set of possible licenses that can exist in an ECC landscape. But with S4 is the number is a bit reduced. So you have professional use, functional use, productivity use, and developer, of course. And yes, we do this very often. Basically, we would simulate the equivalent licenses or the licenses the user would need in an S4 contract or an S4 environment based if the customer is currently on ECC, we could have a look or the tool could analyze the current activity of the users and identify the equivalent license type that they might need in an S4 contract. So we have, what we did is we translated basically the definition that SAP provides for S4 licenses in text format. So they explain in sentences what the users are supposed to be doing or allowed to be doing. We translated that into a set of application components or rules that the tool knows how to interpret so that it can basically understand the equivalent license type and recommend an equivalent license type in an S4 contract. Right. Maybe if we can go back just one moment to the S4 slide. I haven't really gone into the numbers. I just explained roughly what the idea behind is, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory. You'd see the shift from the ECC licenses in the measured in SAP. That's the configuration currently in the system, but the optimized column would indicate what to recommend. And obviously you see the numbers there, and underneath again the cost calculations, and of course, as Rogan mentioned earlier in the slides, you'd see the cost saving potential that you have if you do truly optimize the licenses. Thank you.
And this is really important because if you want to determine exactly what your S4 user licenses should be going forward, you should be running a tool that can actually do this for you without you trying to make these, let me call it guesstimates, with regards to what are the correct licenses to have moving from ECC to S4HANA. If you're not able to do this, and it's a really, this is just not something that you can manage easily from a manual basis. And it's really important that you get this right, because if you don't get this right, the cost implications for you as an organization can be really significantly against you, not in your favor. So I think really if you're going to move anywhere off ECC, and we spoke about the transition from ECC to S4HANA, get the tooling to come in, do the right simulation, make sure it's accurate, make sure that you base it on the right optimization numbers, and then move correctly. right size your licenses. Don't move before you haven't right sized them, and do the simulation so that you make sure that you've got the right numbers. And I think this takes us into the next stage, which is all where customers are really getting RISE licensing proposals from SAP. And maybe you can just take us through a quick slide in terms of RISE licensing, because this is a whole new category of licensing from a technical perspective, using full user equivalence, how we come out with these values. So go for it.
Mhm. So you're right. That's also the next stage, RISE. So the approach from the tool side is quite similar. The tool would look at the user's current activity and identify the equivalent RISE licenses that they might need. It's quite a similar process to the S4 licenses, where we looked at the definition of the RISE licenses, what the users are allowed to be doing with the specific license type, and translated that into activity, transactions, application components, or rule sets that we can configure in the tool. So similar setup in there, but the interesting part, or the new part when it comes to RISE, is this FUE, the full user equivalent, where a user is not equivalent to a license type, but to an FUE or a portion of an FUE. So the new column, the report or the table you see on the slide has a new column next to the optimized column. The optimized column is still indicating the number of users per category, but the column to the right of it is showing the RISE FUE. So it's calculating the ratio or the FUE equivalent you would need to cover the users identified per category. But the approach is quite similar as we saw before. Users activity would indicate the optimal license they would need in this environment.
Excellent. Thanks, Joanna. And moving swiftly, I think it's important to understand, what do you get from VOQUZ Labs? So we've covered some of the technical aspects of it. Joanna also spoke about the advisory aspects of it. So I think what's important that if I can wrap this up, is really three main things there. You can see them on the left-hand side. So first of all, you need to adapt the constant change in your business environment. You need to adapt to that. And your user licenses need to reflect those changes. Okay, so if you can't make those changes on an ongoing basis automatically and having automation built in, that puts you at a disadvantage. It's not easy to save costs if you don't have automation processes. Everybody is moving towards automation, whether it's robotic process automation or IoT, etc. You should be looking at that just from a licensing perspective too. Okay. Secondly, SAP's costs must be calculated into the future. So do a detailed total cost of ownership analysis. Don't leave yourself short. Don't try and only do this for 1 year. Rather look at the 3 to 5 year plan. And if necessary, extrapolate that further. So make sure that your license landscape caters for the change in the next 3 to 5 years, the short term to medium term approach that you're going to be having as an organization. And then thirdly, you want to minimize the internal effort that you actually are spending to manage these processes. And this is where tooling really helps you. If you can keep your administration effort as low as possible in terms of cost and effort from a managed service perspective on automating your licenses, that's going to save you money inherently. So here's quick and easy ways to save you costs and how we go about doing that with organizations. I think that makes it clear to everyone. I think in terms of what do you get from us, looking at the overall costs from advisory queue perspective and from building a business case accurately, you can save up to 50%, making sure that you look at the application management services, cloud infrastructure, funding for that cloud infrastructure, etc., taking all the relevant portions that make up the business case, bringing them together helps you to save money fundamentally at the end of the day. And that's what customers should really be looking at. And then let me just take you through that. That's really part of our advisory queue business case analysis. You can see at a very high level here what we achieve in terms of making sure that we have the product category analysis, the service analysis, the business case components, and finally, at the top end here, the analysis of the financial scenarios. That's really what makes it tick, what makes it work for organizations is this here. When we look at it from a SAMQ perspective, we create a very valuable set of data and in a dashboard format that you can reutilize across your organization. So making sure that you have all the license pillars of licensing covered, from digital access to engines to the unlimited case analysis where you may be on a UDD contract, to cost control elements and user licensing. This is all covered within our SAMQ license dashboard functionality so that you can easily track and manage your licenses on an ongoing basis. And that, I think, really gets us to the point here where if you want to start about rethinking the process of license optimization and cost containment, then we have a proven methodology which helps you to determine the TCO, helps you to understand the right terms and conditions, the right metrics that you have, and it is proven in multiple projects. It has 2 solutions and 2 tools that we use in order to facilitate this. So there's automation built in, and this enables you to get the maximum amount out of your SAP contract. It's independent, and we also recommend various terms and conditions. So I want to say thanks to Ioana. Great having you on this webinar today and helping me to explain technically some of the real nuances around how do we determine the right license structure for customers. And I'm sure lots of customers have it, and I know, I don't even have to say this, but I know so many customers have had such a fantastic experience working with Ioana. I want to say thanks very much to Ioana again, and we'll catch you in the next webinar.
Thank you.
Okay then. Right, thank you and welcome back. Hope we had a good time on the session, and looking forward to some questions. There are some questions in there, but before we do that, I wanted to jump into potentially if we could launch some polls. I see that while the video is still playing, technically we can't do that, so we might just skip that at the moment. There were also some hands raised during the webinar session, so what I'd like to do is just ask you, if you do have a hand raised, please can you put that in the chat or in the questions box and we can answer that. Okay, great, our polls are up and running, so that's great. Let's launch some polls. So I just want to get some idea out there from people regarding how they're going with regards to their S4HANA migration. So let's launch the poll here and hopefully you can get it on there. And it'd be good to see just an indication. It gives us good feedback from our audience. What is your planning going forward in terms of S4HANA? Lots of customers are on the fence, as they would say, or waiting to see what happens. And we'll give it a few extra minutes here. So, okay, let's just give it a little bit more time for people to vote on the poll here. Okay, let's try to get the last few people in. Interesting to see the results coming through. I'll share the results now, and it may be a combination of factors that have influenced this. Of course, different people are in different organizations and different organizational spaces, but just to get an idea, to see where things are going, and if you compare this to what's happening out in the market space in terms of that, it's good to get an understanding. Okay, right, let's close the poll there, and let's just share that. So we see that 62% of those people who answered saying yes, they have actually started planning their S4HANA migration path, and 38% saying no. For those of you who say no, hey, reach out to us, would be great to get involved and help you with your planning. Okay, what about cloud? I think a very important question around cloud. So I think one of the biggest challenges in the cloud space is to understand that there's a change in the operational model. So moving from an on-premise operational model where your application layer is sitting on an on-premise data set to a cloud set changes your application and operational model. How is that progressing? Interesting to see that there's been such a drive towards cloud, and good to see if the information comes out here. Very interesting. 50% saying yes and 50% saying no at the moment. Let's give it A few more yeses have come in. Let's see if there's any more yeses. I think fundamental to understand the drive that SAP has for the cloud. So again, I'll wait another few more seconds. Okay, let's close it up. We try to give about a minute for every poll. So if you can answer in the minute, that's great. Otherwise, it tends to be a bit longer. Let's see the poll here. So yes, yeah, a true representation of where organizations are going to. Cloud is a very distinct determining factor for what's happening in the IT market space. Okay, 2 more polls to go. We'll try and get them to them quite quickly. Let's see how many customers have a current SAP software asset management tool in place. Let's just see, try to make it simple to get some feedback on the vote here. And we go from there. Okay, we've got another 15 seconds. And then certainly I see that there are definitely some questions coming into the session today. Great, I'll answer those shortly. We have 1 more poll to go. Let's give it another 15 seconds for the number of votes to come in. 10 seconds to go. So if you say no, I think one of the biggest questions in terms of this poll is to ask you, how are you managing your licenses from a mechanization and optimization and automation perspective? I think that's the biggest challenge here. So if you're not using a tool, it makes it extremely difficult to do this manually. And what you're doing in essence is relying on SAP to drive the license discussion. And I think that's a consideration should really take into factor. Just reach out to us, as I say, from a savings perspective. Tooling helps you to automate and therefore derive savings. It's proven right throughout. So get in touch with us. And our last poll quickly, let's hide it for the moment here. Have you identified your business case, or have you started with a business case for the changes that's going to take place in your SAP journey in the next 2 to 3 to 5 years? For those of you who are on ECC 6 and have only managed to get to enterprise level 5, I mean, there are changes in the maintenance period. You only have up until 2025, and then your maintenance runs out. If you have enterprise level and EHP 5, 6 and upwards to 8, etc., then you've got until 2027 before your maintenance actually runs out. So definitely, I think a business case is vital. So we want to check how many customers are actually starting with that business case, and it helps us to give feedback around that. Okay, we've almost got the full vote in. Let's give it another 10 seconds, and then I'll just close the poll and we can just share this. So there we go. So 52% say yes, they have a business case, 48% no. Very close values here. So I definitely think that there's a definite need for getting the business case in place, and definitely reach out to us. We help organizations with that business case. So thank you for filling in those polls. It's good for us to get feedback, how our audience see things, and then it's at least a bit more interactive in terms of these webinars. Let's go to the questions. I just want to open the question panel quickly and just pop it out for myself so I can see that. And I know some people had some issues with audio, so hopefully we do, just so that everybody's aware, we do record the audio. And let me just close the poll questions here, otherwise it's going to sit up the whole time. Let's hide that. Okay, that's a whole lot better. Okay, so one of the questions, a very good question here, is around from a tooling perspective, how do you manage the licenses if they're fixed? And you say you can't reduce them. Well, it's a matter of negotiating with SAP. The first thing to do is to determine what the difference is in terms of your actual usage versus your allocated usage. If you can't determine that, there's no point in even having a negotiation with SAP. So the way we normally approach that for most organizations is we run what's called a quick license assessment, where we actually determine what the optimization potential really is. And then from there, we actually start the process of helping organizations to actually reduce your licensing, because there are levers, there are mechanisms, there are ways to do that. So definitely we can do that. Reach out to us and we can show you examples of how we've helped organizations do that. Can the SAMQ do the license allocations based on the existing authorizations? Yes, certainly we can do allocations. So the license can do the assessment on the existing authorization set. So that is important to note, that there's such a close tie-in between the authorization concept and the licensing structure. And in most cases, what's happening is that because of the authorization concept and the way in which the licenses have been allocated due to that concept, it actually creates a bit of a challenge there. So that's why the tooling does this. So most certainly we do take this into consideration, because the transaction sets are linked to the roles, which is linked to the authorizations in the context of that. And so we can help you organize that with that principle from a tooling perspective. Okay, another question here. From a customer's perspective, what are the advantages of SAMQ compared to other SAP add-on optimization tools in the market? Well, the first one is that if we look at our competitors and from their tools, I don't speak negatively on competitors' tools, I just try and compare the kind of some items there. One is that SAMQ is only installed in one single system, normally on Solution Manager or on a dev box or whichever system you decide to. If you're not using Solution Manager, you don't have to install it multiple times on every single SAP dev and production box that you're measuring. And we create RFC connections, we use existing RFC connections. So the installation implementation is extremely efficient. Secondly, we come out with a whole lot of boilerplate definitions that are already pre-built into the tool, so it's quickly and easy to install. And thirdly, because we've worked from an advisory capacity across many industries, many organizations that have very complex licensing definitions, for us to add those definition types into the tool makes a very big difference. Now, some of the other vendors don't have that advisory capability, so they don't have that contextual background in which to implement this into the tooling system, and that really is what the difference is. And then the outputs of this, we really take through a value-added process from an advisory perspective. So in essence, we don't just leave you alone with the tool to determine the outcomes. We actually help organizations get the best outcome and maximize their value of their investment in SAP. Why is adoption versus bring your own license? I think there's a lot of challenge, especially for very large organizations with regards to WOQUZ. It isn't a fit model for very large organizations, especially on the extremes where you've got a lot of ABAP coding, etc. I definitely think that there is room for negotiation with SAP with regards to bring your own license. And certainly that's something we can discuss with you specifically in your organization. So I would say reach out to us. As I said earlier, what we see in the marketplace is a very distinct push from SAP to only have RISE as an option, but I don't think that is the right fit case for many organizations, especially in the large enterprise space. It just doesn't make sense. I think there are too many factors and that need to be considered there, and I think bringing your own license actually is one that certainly should be considered. And I think there the best thing is to build a business case which actually showcases all the various different TCO options. If you don't do that, then you're not knowing actually what you're deciding on. So build a proper business case with relevant TCOs. Let us help you with that and you can get that. How can we reduce the count of developer licenses? Well, that's an analysis that we can do for you using the SAMQ tool. We can actually determine some items in there. It also depends on where you are at in terms of a project. Let me use an example. For example, if you are in a case where you're actually doing a current project, an S/4HANA transformation, we've had organizations that have had to go and negotiate certain developer licensing constructs, if I can put it that way. I'm not going to go into the details of that with SAP because they're in project mode and they're going to be using a lot of developers. So there are ways in which you can actually find a most optimal outcome from a licensing perspective around the developer license. Of course, why do I say it's important to know this? Because the developer license is the most expensive user license. So you need to minimize those. But the first part is let's do an assessment of what licenses you have. Do you have additional developers in the system that you should actually expire and get out of the system? So these are important things. Can we use the tool to calculate the required count of user licenses? Yeah, absolutely. The tool helps you to make sure that before you go live, you actually have the right count of licenses, but not only before you go live, but all the way through. The system is to maintain the right number of licenses all the way through. Just remember, I mean, if you rely on SAP's audit tooling to give you the answer that you really want, it will give you the answer that SAP wants, but not necessarily the answer your customer or you as the customer of SAP wants. So I think it's very important to have an independent view of your licensing construct. Otherwise, you're led down a certain path with SAP that's to their best interests and not necessarily to yours. So I think it's always important to get that independent view from a licensing perspective. I'm not sure if there are any other questions, but please, as I said, we do have a link up. It was in the presentation set to us, labs@VOQUZlabs.com. Reach out to us on email. We can certainly answer additional questions that you have. And I'd like to thank you for attending our webinar session today and look forward to our future webinars coming up on our website. Check them out there, register for them, and we look forward to having you in those sessions. And yeah, if there are further questions, I'll answer them online and we can send them back to everybody. Great. A successful rest of the day to everybody out there, and keep well. Thank you.